In Chapter 8, we're going to talk about influence and leadership. Folks, I think this chapter and this topic of influence, frankly, defines the essence of leadership and the essence of the difference between leadership and management. Because the reality is, for most leaders, is that they get more done through influence than they do control. Now, last chapter we talked about power, and in this chapter we're going to talk about the difference between power and influence. But I want you to recall that my definition, anyway, of leadership was influencing people toward positive change. And so as we talk through this chapter, I think what you're going to see is that the very definition of leadership encompasses the ability to influence people and to get things done through influence rather than through other means. So I think this is a really critical, pay very careful attention to it as we go through it. The concepts of power and influence are very closely related, and in fact you'll find a lot of people use those two together. They'll talk about power and influence and the power to influence and so forth. So this slide here, we just define the difference between the two, at least for our purposes and for this discussion. So we say that influence is the ability to affect the behavior of another person. That is, to get another person to do what you want them to do. Power is the potential or the capacity to influence. So what we'll see is that in order to influence someone, you have to have established your power, a power base from which to influence. So leaders cannot influence without some kind of power. Now I want you to remember, though, all the different kinds of power that we talked about in the last chapter, because the way in which you influence people, that is, the power base that you use to influence people, is going to make a big difference in the result that you achieve. Here we have another one of those academic-looking models, but it turns out that this particular diagram has a lot of really important information in it. So I want you to hang with me here and let's talk about the different components of this model. And I'm going to start at the right side of the diagram. If you look there, you see three possible outcomes from influence. And it's these outcomes that really define, I think, why influence is so important and why it's more important to lead through influence than it is through control of people. Let's look at this. We've got three levels here. We've got resistance, compliance, and then commitment. Now, if a leader operates solely from a reward and coercive power base, that is, the carrot and stick kind of approach, it's very possible to get people to do what you, or at least to appear to do what you want them to do, by using what we might, in common language, call raw power or control over people. The reality is, all that you really get is compliance. You don't win people's hearts by using your coercive power. It is true that most leaders, particularly in higher positions, have a tremendous amount of coercive power. But if all they do is lead through coercive power, or even coercive power and reward power, yes, you get people who are at least nominally going through the motions and appearing to do what the leader wants, but in reality they're just complying and just doing what it takes to earn the reward or avoid the punishment. To build great organizations or great communities or great churches, you have to get people to commit to the vision, commit to the goals and the vision and the cause that the leader is promoting. The only way to do that is to influence them to commit, not to use raw power to control them. And this is a critical concept. And I think it defines the essence of what leadership is all about, and the difference between leadership and management. And that is that a lot of management controls and management processes and management systems are very good at getting people to comply with what we want them to do. But they don't inspire people to commit to a vision and to greatness and excellence. And that's what leadership is all about. Now, if we take it a step further, is that if a leader overdoes the use of their reward and coercive power, then one possible response is active resistance. And if you think about it, compliance is kind of a almost passive resistance. Compliance is the attitude that says, okay, I better do what the boss wants. If I don't do it, I may get in trouble here, so I better do at least enough to stay out of trouble. But in some instances, when leaders operate from too much of a coercive power base, the result is resistance. People just don't do what the leader wants them to do. Now you might say, well, then can't the leader just fire everybody? Can't the leader fire some people? And the answer is, yeah, they can. But think about it for a minute. If you're a leader in a company, can you fire everybody? No. Very few leaders have enough power, enough absolute power to overcome massive resistance in the organization. And this is why you see CEOs that fail. A lot of CEOs try to implement a vision, and the organizations simply resist them. They're not able to influence the organization. And so we like to think of leaders as having this tremendous amount of power, and they do. Don't get me wrong, but in truth, very few of them have so much power that they can overcome massive resistance in the organization. And so as a leader, you really have to think about most people toward commitment rather than controlling them, which gets you compliance at best and may well lead to resistance. All right, so how do we get there? Well, we're going to talk about some tactics here, but I want you now to look at the left side of this slide. And we have 3 bubbles there. And what this says is that the influence tactics that a leader chooses are dependent upon the leader's personal traits, the behaviors the leader chooses, and the situation. Now let me talk about each of these for just a moment. Let's take first the leader's traits. The personality and the personal characteristics of the leader are going to play a big role in which influence tactics they choose to use. As your book says, if you have a leader who is an extrovert, who's very warm and charming, they may use a lot of personal charisma to influence people. I'll take myself as an example in the saying that I was not blessed with that. That is not one of my strengths. So I rely on a different power base, and that is an expert power base to try and influence people through my expertise rather than through some personal charisma or personal charm. And so a leader like me may rely much more on rational persuasion rather than personal charm and charisma. So you see that this is why in our companion course HRE 2723 we really emphasize so much understanding yourself and particularly what your strengths are, because there's no one right way to influence people. But there is a right way for a given leader to choose, because they really need to come from their strengths and use the power base that they're most effective with. Now, let's look at I'm going to jump down to the third bubble, and that is the situation. The type of influence needed can vary greatly depending on the situation. And there are a couple different aspects of this. One is the culture of the organization that you're working within. I remember our former chancellor, who was head of NASA, talked about how in mission control in Houston, there's this big sign up that says, "In God we trust, all others bring data." Well, guess what influence tactic you have to use in that culture? You must use rational persuasion. The engineers and the scientists and so forth in that culture are not going to listen to anything else. But suppose that we're in a very creative organization, a highly creative environment. Then maybe an inspirational appeal is going to be more important than a rational, persuasive type of argument. So that the type of organization and the culture of that organization is going to make a huge difference. But even within those cultures, the specific situation can make an example I used earlier when we talked about crisis situations. You know, that there's a time in a crisis when people need to hear an inspirational appeal from a leader. And so a crisis might demand a different influence tactic than, say, normal day-to-day operations. So as a leader, you have to understand, of course, your strengths, but then how that matches up with different situations and different organizational cultures and different environments. And then, of course, the leader's behaviors, and that is their skill or ability to exercise certain influence tactics is a third factor that comes into play. I'm terrible at humor. Some leaders can use humor wonderfully as a way to influence people and as part of their charisma and their charm. I'm terrible at it. I can't do it. Therefore, I don't use it. You, on the other hand, that may be one of your strengths. So you see what we have here then is it's a blend of what kind of personality and traits I have, what behaviors or tactics I'm good at, and what the situation demands that determines the influence tactics that I should be using. But fundamentally, let me remind you here that, in my opinion, using influence tactics is not a choice. The only way to get people to commit is to try and influence them rather than control them. I want you to just think about your own personal life experience. Pick any job, pick any situation you've been in. And think about the times that you've done what a leader wants you to do just because they demand it. How motivated were you? How did you go through the motions, or did you really reach to do it the best possible, or to do the best possible job you could? Versus those times when somebody took the time to influence you and convince you that it was the right idea, and to get you to internally commit to it. And think about your own reactions. If you're like most people, the second scenario is the one where you just work as hard as you can to be as good as you can, do as good a job as possible. If we as leaders can get a whole organization doing that, then you build a great organization. If you take the first approach, what you end up with is organizations that are moderately successful, perhaps. They may not go out of business, but they don't become great. This slide just emphasizes those three levels of outcomes that I was talking about. I suggest to you that our goal as a leader should always be to strive toward getting people committed. It's commitment we have to have if we're going to accomplish lofty visions. If you're doing your job as a leader, you're setting high goals, you're setting big visions, and the only way you get there is with followers who are highly committed to what you're doing, which means influence is a must. So the tactics that we use to influence people vary tremendously, and they vary in complexity, and they vary in how much time it requires to develop them. And as a leader, you of course don't want to invest any more in the influence process than is necessary to get the commitment. What your book then does is to separate the influence tactics into what your author considers to be essentially ethical and honest techniques versus unethical or dishonest influence techniques. Now, I'll tell you before we get to these tactics, I take a little issue with with the ethical versus unethical, because actually I can describe a way in which all of them can be used ethically or can be used unethically. But I get the author's point that the first group we're going to talk about, the so-called ethical tactics, are mostly ethical, usually used ethically. But of course, if you take anything to an extreme, it can become unethical. The ones that he labels as unethical, I think, are a little bit more problematic, but I'll talk more about that in just a moment. This slide summarizes a big chunk of the chapter, actually, as it presents 10 commonly used and essentially ethical and honest influence tactics. I don't think any of them are real hard to understand, but I'm going to talk through each of them just briefly. First, number one, leading by example and respect. Now, I want you to recognize that this would be operating from a referent power base. That is, if you have personal qualities that people want to emulate, then you're leading by example and respect. Let me give you the most common example of this is your ethics and your integrity. If you as a leader are leading in a highly ethical way and your ethics are above reproach, and you lead with the utmost integrity, then the result is that a lot of people will want to emulate you, and you set an example and influence them by who you are in what you do and how you conduct yourself. I think, frankly, this is a must for leaders. You know, I think we overlook the fact sometimes that when you move into a leadership position, it's like being under a microscope, that people are watching you all the time and taking their cues from you in the way you do things, in the way you conduct yourself. And it's extremely important to make your behavior and your actions consistent with what you're trying to influence others to do. The second, using rational persuasion. Very common technique, obviously, particularly in the business world, where you influence others by doing your research, doing your homework, so to speak, and making a logical, rational argument to people. Now, a note of caution, though. There are many things that people don't respond rationally to. Let's take, for example, organizational change. People are scared. No matter how rational you argue that some change is necessary, people may still resist it. So I have seen, in business particularly, many leaders try rational persuasion when they're really, and be resisted, because the resistance is coming from an irrational place, an emotional place. It's not logical. But they keep trying to use logic and provide a rationale for what they want people to do. And they're frustrated when people don't respond rationally. So don't overuse it. Make sure you're using it at the right time. But obviously, it's a very important tactic. Kind of number three, in my mind, kind of goes along with number two, or it can, and that's developing a reputation as a subject matter expert. If you are the go-to person on certain subject matter, you gain power. What power base is this? It's the expert power base, and it can lead to you becoming very influential within your organization, within your industry, within whatever context you operate. Now, number four, exchanging favors and bargaining. So, way of life in the professional world. From the smallest thing, such as, hey, if you'll stay late today to do this extra work for me, you can knock off Friday afternoon early, to the largest scale, where you're negotiating between clients and suppliers and organizations. In fact, some things, even on the national scale, can be seen as bargaining, where our political leaders try and coax us into doing the promise of something better in the future. So exchanging favors and bargaining, very, very typical leader influence approach. Number five, legitimating a request. This is where you use somebody else's power to support what you're asking for. Typical example, in the mid-level leadership positions in an organization, you may be trying to get a colleague or a peer to do something, and you argue that this is consistent with what our CEO has told us we need to be doing in this organization. You've just legitimated it. You've borrowed the CEO's power to help you influence somebody to do what you want them to do. Number 6, making an inspirational appeal and an emotional display. This is kind of the opposite of number 2, the rational persuasion, but it's clearly something that we all respond to. Look what Barack Obama has been able to do because of, in part because of his rational persuasion, but also in part because he's an inspirational speaker. And the best leaders know how to touch your heart as well as your head. Number 7, consulting with people. As we have talked about, people like to be involved in making decisions. So if we're trying to influence people in to follow our vision, the more we can make them part of the process, consult with them, get their input, get their ideas, the more likely they are to buy in. And to follow us. Number 8, forming coalitions. We certainly see this happen in the political process all the time. But it happens inside business organizations as well, where if you're trying to influence people, that you join together, you take your power, multiple people's power, and put it together, and you become more powerful and more influential as a result of it. The key thing about coalitions is that they form and disband around specific issues. So you might have a coalition form around the need to make a specific change, one specific change in the organization, and those same people might be on opposite sides of another issue. So there's a whole big field of study around coalitions, and we see this in our political process all the time, where legislators band together to pass one bill, but then oppose each other in another bill. Becoming a team player, clearly, I think that speaks for itself. That you become influential by showing that, hey, you're part of the team. Your book talks about things like pitches in to help out, so that you're showing that you really support people on the team. Number 10, hands-on leadership. A lot of times our followers, particularly in organizational life, like to see us get our hands dirty. And the more that in certain instances and in certain cultures, getting your hands on the task, getting your hands dirty makes you a more influential person. Now, on the other hand, this isn't a license to micromanage, because micromanagement can totally discourage people in the organization. Now, what I also want to point out, though, as I was saying a minute ago, actually I could come up with scenarios where all of these would be used unethically. I agree with the author that they're usually ethical, but if for example, if they're done let's take something like an inspirational appeal and emotional display. Is that ethical if it's disingenuous? If a person really doesn't believe it, if they really don't feel it? You certainly can make use a rational argument with statistics that you've twisted to fit what you want to happen. Is it ethical if you're doing things to look like a team player and be hands-on, and you're really not? It's just a show. Is it still ethical if you're consulting with people and getting their input, and the reality is you don't care? Your mind's already made up. Is that still ethical? So I think there's some legitimate questions that can be raised around these, but on the face of it, yeah, they're basically honest and ethical tactics. Now this list I have a lot more problems with, because I think it's really kind of tough or walking a fine line to start to label these as unethical. But let's talk about them, and I'll share my thoughts on each of them. Now, the first one, deliberate Machiavellianism, is one that I think everybody would agree is unethical. If you're not sure what it means to be Machiavellian, as your book said, it's strong, ruthless, cynical leaders that are self-centered and self-serving. Okay, we can all agree that's unethical. Machiavellian leaders will do anything to advance their cause. They'll stab you in the back. They'll just do anything. And clearly, that's unethical. I don't have a problem with that one. Now, the next one, gentle manipulation of people and situations. This is one I start that I'm not sure I totally agree with. And because think about this for a minute. Aren't we always, as leaders, manipulating people to some degree? That is, if I'm trying to motivate you and influence you to do what I want you to do, isn't that a form of manipulation? So I really wonder where you draw the line between what's ethical and unethical here. Now, for example, your book talks about the bandwagon technique as being an example here. And that is using peer pressure by saying everybody else is doing it. Yeah, I'm going to tell you that that's a standard sales technique when people go out to sell products to the customers and say that, well, you know, your competitors are doing this and they're using this technique or they're using this product. You really need to get on board here. You know, is it wrong to go into an employee and say, look, you know, everybody else on the team has bought into this idea. You're the last one who's holding out. Is that wrong? I don't think so. I don't agree. So particularly with the word gentle, I hope you're all enjoying hearing my dog bark. Particularly with the word gentle manipulation, this is a hard one for me to explain to you exactly why it's always going to be unethical. Now, the third one, I think, is a little easier to understand, and that's undue pressure. You know, clearly, leaders can become abusive with their demands on people and the pressure that they put on people to do things. And I think, particularly when you start to introduce, as your book says, bribes for compliance, threats for, threats of punishment that are severe if you don't do what the leader wants to do, then I think, I think there's a case to be made there. On the other hand, you talk about bribes for compliance. What if a CEO says, "I'll give you a 20% raise if you get on board with this"? It's a bribe. Is it wrong? I don't know. I don't know that it is. There certainly are many instances where leaders threaten people with their jobs and fire people because they disagree with what the leader wants done. Now that's pressure, and that's undue pressure. Would the author really suggest that you should never fire anybody who disagrees with you? I don't know. Okay, debasement. Now this one I have a real problem with, calling unethical. And debasement is where you kind of demean yourself in order to influence the other person. Your book talks about a former CEO of Time Warner who always tried to get people to underestimate him by kind of taking himself down some notches. Now, again, I don't know if that's really unethical. What's wrong with acting humble and minimizing your power in order to get somebody on board with you? I don't know about that. Ingratiation. Another one that I have that I'm not sure I agree with your author. Now, of course, this is on a continuum, and we are moving now into the slightly unethical category. But ingratiation, getting somebody to like you personally in order to influence them. And let me read some of the things from your book as examples of this tactic. Making him or her feel important, like saying only you have the brains and talent to do this. Acting very humbly toward him or her when making the request. Praising him or her. Asking in a polite way. Pretended I was letting him or her decide to do what I wanted. That is, acting in a pseudo-democratic manner. Folks, this happens day in and day out in professional life in a way to influence others. I don't know if I can agree that it's really unethical to do that. Many professional relationships are built on this, and you will have many people that you would never think of having lunch with or really doing anything on a personal level with, but you work to build this strong relationship with them in the hopes of influencing them to do something. Okay, and then now we get to joking and kidding, and my response to your author here would be, you've got to be kidding me. That joking and kidding is a way to influence people. Hey, what's wrong with that? And then lastly, upward appeal. That is getting a person with more formal authority to do your influencing for you. I suppose just like when you look at this list, just like the last list, that taken to an extreme, yes, these could be unethical. But I can come up with many scenarios for everything except the deliberate Machiavellianism that I personally don't find unethical. So I hope you think about it. As I said in the ethics chapter, ultimately we each have to have our own core values. And I want you to think about whether you're comfortable using these influence tactics. I agree to the author to this extent. I'd rather use one of the first list, that is the last slide, than I would these 7. I think the last 10 are the best ones. These 7, though, are common tools that I think every leader relies on from time to time, except for number 1, the Machiavellian. Research provides us some guidelines on how to choose from amongst these tactics or tools in our toolkit, if you will. If we look at a study that was done by Gary Uckel and Bruce Tracy, it's a very good study, and looked at the effectiveness of these influence tactics. And we see that the most effective tactics were these 3. Rational persuasion, that makes sense. Inspirational appeal, yeah, it makes sense. And consultation. That is appealing to the brain through rational persuasion, the heart through inspirational appeal, and consultation to get buy-in. And that's a great guideline, and I think those are the 3 most commonly used, certainly. The least effective tactics, putting pressure on people, building coalitions, and by the way, this study was in business organizations, so hence coalitions would not be as big a deal. And then legitimating a request. Okay, those make good sense to me, and it's a good starting point for you to think about when you're choosing a technique, to think about those top 3. A little more refined look at the tactics is to look at the direction in which those tactics are focused. So first, if we look at the most effective tactics in a downward direction, that it means toward a lower ranking person. First is inspirational appeal. Second is ingratiation. Now remember, your author said, well, that was kind of unethical. Again, I don't agree with that. And third was pressure. Because clearly, as a person's boss, you have the ability to pressure them. Now, these may have been identified as the most effective, which also means the most commonly used. I would suggest to you, though, they're not the right approach. Inspirational appeal is fine, but using pressure, remember what I said, pressure gets you compliance. If you want commitment, I like the last slide, the top 3 in general: rational persuasion, inspirational appeal, consultation are more likely to get you the commitment. Then the second part of the slide, though, talks about tactics in a lateral direction. The first is a personal appeal, and that's fine. The second is exchange, very common with peers in the organization. It's the old, I'll scratch your back if you scratch my back kind of approach. And legitimating, showing how what you're trying to influence them to do is consistent with what those higher in the organization want. So here's the general strategy. And some of this is common sense, but it's supported by research. Start out with the most positive, least abrasive tactic. And then, of course, if necessary, turn up the heat. Proceed to stronger tactics and more abrasive tactics only as a last resort, and only for something that's really important. I think leaders really have to pick their battles. Not every change that you want to make is worth pulling out the most abrasive tactics possible. You really need to decide as a leader what's most important to you, and use your strongest influence tactics for those things that matter most to you. If you try it too often, you're simply going to build up resistance. This slide emphasizes to us, I think, that there is a cost every time you try and influence people in the organization. And the best way to think about this is to think about your power as a bank account. And you do things that put money in that bank account, and then every time you try and influence or make changes, you're spending some of that bank account. And you have to be smart about it. So, as the slide says, you always want to start with the lowest cost, lowest risk kind of tactic. And then think about whether it's worth it to you to proceed to higher cost, higher risk tactics. Because that bank account is not unlimited. You often hear about the concept of political chips. And that is, as a leader, as you do things, as you accomplish things, as you help people be successful in the organization, you're able to make deposits to that bank account. But every time you try and implement changes and influence people to change, you're using up that power. You're using some of that bank account. So you have to be really conscious of the balance in the bank account, and decide, just like our personal budgets, decide where you want to spend that political capital, that power, in order to influence changes. And there, as I said in the beginning of this, is that every leader has limits to their power, some more so than others. And I know we don't think of that a lot of times. We think of that CEOs of an organization have all this tremendous power and they can do anything they want to do, and that's just not the case. Every leader at every level has limits. Then they have to be conscious of those and make sure they spend their political capital wisely to influence change. One of the things that influences followers as to whether they will allow themselves to be influenced by leaders or not are what we call implicit leadership theories. And that is, these are the assumptions or expectations that we have about what a leader ought to do and ought to be like. And the more that a leader fits these assumptions or these stereotypes, if you will, the more likely we are to follow that person. And these implicit theories are actually something that are developed over time through socialization, through role models that have been influential in your life, past experiences with leaders. And oftentimes they're not even fully conscious to you. You may have had a youth group leader in your church back when you were very young who you really admired, and you internalize that person's characteristics as a leader, and without realizing it, look for that same type as an ideal leader. And so the more that a leader fits that prototype, if you will, of the ideal leader, the more likely we are to let him or her influence us. Research says that the typical prototype that people have of their ideal leader is in the left-hand column of this slide, and that there's 6 basic characteristics. Number 1, sensitivity, that is being compassionate to people. Number 2, intelligence. 3, dedication, that is motivated and dedicated to the cause or the organization. 4, charismatic and dynamic. 5, strength. being strong and bold. And number 6, attractiveness, well-dressed, classy. Now you can agree or disagree with these, but this is from research what people say that they would like to see in their ideal leader. Now the anti-prototype, which is what they don't want to see, are leaders who are tyrannical, who act as tyrants, dominant, selfish, manipulative, and masculinity, who lead in a male or a masculine-oriented way. So I don't think there's a lot to argue with here. There's probably one thing that's troubling, and that is that attractiveness comes into play. But the research says that it does. The rest of this, I think, is a pretty good prototype for what we ought to be aiming for as leaders: sensitive, intelligent, dedicated, charismatic, strong. We all know that tyrannical leaders get nowhere, and that of course some of these characteristics on the left are the opposite of a masculine or male-oriented leadership